Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the series Palestine through a decolonial lens. Today I wanted to spend some time in looking at the record of massacres, and in particular a focus on the 1948 period of massacres that have been conducted and the violence that have resulted in the mass ethnic cleansing of Palestine. To begin with, and I think it's very important that this effort is to try to place the factual record on the table and to dispense with this notion that the Palestinian refugee crisis or the Palestinian refugees left the country on their own, and that Israel and Zionism in particular had no role, or if they had a role, it was incidental to the overall project of creating and bringing about the establishment of the State of Israel. And as such, you'll see many writers that speak on behalf and try to promote the Israeli perspective. One dispense or attempt to dispense with the notion of any type of deliberate effort, or if they take responsibility, they try to minimize that responsibility, saying that what took place, it was in the heat of battle, and as such there wasn't any direct responsibility to what has taken place. The larger framework or the larger question in here is on the existence of a deep understanding and a deep acceptance of the need to transfer the Palestinians out from Palestine in order to bring about a demographic majority for Zionist Jewish population that was increasingly arriving in Palestine. Now we have the understanding that from the get-go, the Zionist, in particular Herzl himself, have called for the transfer or the concept of removing the Palestinian population by saying early on is to spirit the penniless Palestinian population or the penniless Arab population across the borders, meaning outside of Palestine. And he was thinking also that by procuring employment for it outside of Palestine, in essence to couch the ethnic cleansing and the transfer in somewhat of a humanitarian purpose. And literally some Zionists would point that this was not something to be thought of as malicious, but they're trying to assist and help the Palestinians by removing them from Palestine into surrounding countries. And then second, saying Herzl himself that the property owners, meaning the property owners, the Palestinians, landowners, and possibly also those who have some capital, would end up coming to the Zionist side. And I think in some sense what we're seeing today inside Palestine, as well as broadly in the Arab world, where some of those who have economic benefits have lined up and have become almost partners to Israel inside Palestine and outside. So that thought actually was present in Herzl's own thinking and in his own writing at the later part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. More importantly, as the Peel Commission issued its report on Palestine in 1936-37, what we get is that the Zionists accepted the Commission's report because it had in it the idea of transferring population. And I said this before, not only this time, but in earlier lectures, that settler colonialism and colonialism has within it often the idea of transferring population or removing population from one side of a country to the other. Settler colonialism in particular dispenses with indigenous populations by either genocide or transfer. And we see this in the United States history. We see this very clearly with the indigenous population. We see it in Australia, in New Zealand, and we saw it also in South Africa in terms of the transfer project. So as early as 1937, and Ben Gurion actually embraced the transfer policy and stated that it was good that it came from them, meaning from the Peel Commission at the time, and it was incorporated into the thinking, the strategic thinking of Zionists in Palestine in the 1930s and moving forward. A second dimension of this, to point to the planning, that the 1936-39 Arab revolt that took place against the British, but also the British in cooperation with the Zionists, that part of this outcome is that the Zionist movement inside Palestine developed with academics who were already in Palestine, began to do what's called mapping of villages and to identify Palestinians who resisted the British and Zionist encroachment during the 1936-39, and developing essentially a mapping of those communities to be utilized at a very critical period. So this gets us into, for those who do research, the question of the village files that were developed in the 1930s that mapped the Palestinian society, identifying individuals who took part in resistance against the British colonialism and Zionist colonialism, and also looking and beginning to examine which part of the Palestinian society could be actually targeted to become and to engage in collaboration with the Zionist movement at the time in order to undermine the cohesiveness and target the Palestinian society systematically. It is important to note that the 1936-39 was heavily repressed by the British, killing a large number of Palestinians, dismantling and targeting Palestinian civil society, and sending a number of Palestinian leaders to exile, which often possibly can explain the presence of Palestinians in various parts of the world, where some of those early were sent out to exile during that period. So this is just to actually set up the background before we get into the 1947-48, to say that Herzl himself early on adopted the idea of removing the Palestinian population in order to arrive at a Zionist Jewish majority in Palestine, which at the time was only about 3 to 4% at maximum. So that idea was present in Herzl writing. It was present in Jabotinsky's ideas and writing relative to colonialism in the 1920s. And then it gets adopted by the Zionist, World Zionist Organization, as well as Ben Gurion and the Zionists in Palestine. That transfer is part of arriving at a decisive majority Zionist Jewish state in Palestine, and becomes part of the understanding of how to arrive to it, and then adding to it the dimension of beginning to systematically map Palestinian society in such a way that the mapping is to be utilized at a future period. Now, the village files and the mapping of the Palestinians is very important because it plays into right now the discussion about the boycott, divestment, and sanction. Because often you hear individuals where they point that having a boycott against, or a boycott that engages in pointing to academic institutions and their engagement with occupation goes contrary to the whole principle of open inquiry and open intellectual pursuit. Well, in here one has to make a distinction that when intellectuals utilize their scholarship and their research to empower occupation and to empower settler colonialism, then they have actually undermined the basic premise of scholarship and intellectual pursuit. They became embedded intellectuals in a settler colonial project. And I think one has to actually critique the notion that the role of an intellectual, between, I would say, quotation mark, is to be problem solver for settler colonialism, and not only that, to become a partner in the dismantling, dispossession, and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So when we say or speak about academic boycott of Israeli academic institution, is because they have been linked to the hip with the settler colonial project in Palestine. And the question that should be posed to them is what is the ethical foundation for your intellectual pursuit, and how your intellectual academic research is empowering and continues to actually extend Israel settler colonialism in Palestine today, from across, whether it's in the political arena, the demographic arena, security arena, and water resources, environmental studies, all those elements that tend to extend the occupation and actually gives it, in essence, legitimacy. So in here, I would say about the responsibility of the intellectual, the responsibility of the researcher, and why that individual that engages in this is basically undertaking an empowerment of the occupation and continued to provide the intellectual research foundation for it, misguided as it is, but that's what we need to point to. So that is not of recent occurrence, it actually predates the creation of the state itself, that Zionist intellectuals and Zionist researchers and academics were seeing themselves and putting their intellectual and research byproduct in the service of creating the nationalist project. And again, I think this is very clear. So moving to the 1948 massacres and the refugee problem, and I'm sorry using the problem, it's actually the refugee crisis that continues to be with us. The dominant Zionist narrative that is still replicated almost on a daily basis says the following, and I think you could sum it up in the following articulation, that says that Arab leaders called on the Palestinians to flee, to allow the Arab armies and the Arab leaders' power to come and, quote, to throw the Jews to the sea. And in this type of articulation, it is again shifting the responsibility to the Arab leaders and the Palestinians to say it was their fault and their responsibility that they fled, and therefore Israel stand to be innocent of any responsibility for what took place. Now let me take this in a systematic way in order for us to understand. One, the research on this was done really very early on. As early as 1961, Walid al-Khalidi actually wrote about the existence of a plan, and this is the Dalit plan, wrote about it and in essence documented from his research. Again, this is Professor Walid Khalidi that wrote on this issue early on, one of the first to actually write about it, even though we have earlier accounts of individuals who are testifying about what happened and so on. Essentially, 1961, we have this work from Walid al-Khalidi that actually comes to us and speaks of the existence of these massacres and plans for targeting Palestinians in particular areas in the region or the land that the UN have given to the Palestinians and the area that was actually designated to be the Israel state, the Jewish state, in 1948. So we have the Dalit plan. Following this, in 1963, we have actually another research by Childers, who wrote to the Spectator magazine, and essentially wanted to examine this notion that Arab leaders have called the Palestinians to leave. So he went ahead and actually reviewed the recording of all Arab world broadcasts during the period of the hostilities. And now these records, we have a set of these records are available in the Smithsonian Museum in the US, and also another set present in the British Museum. So both records of monitoring the Arab broadcast in the region during the height of the war period, late 1947 and 1948 up to the beginning of 49, all those records are there. And what Erskine B. Childers from the Spectator magazines of 1963 actually showed through reviewing the record that there is no such recording, there is no such calls from any of the Arab broadcasts in the region. What he discovered, or actually found out in his research, is that Arab broadcast was saying to the Palestinians, stay put, because we have no capacity actually to provide the services and to attend to you, to stay put and not to move. So in here, again, Zionist propaganda says that the Arab leaders called them to leave. The evidence actually from the two sets of recordings that actually illustrates otherwise. And now Childers did not only stop at the record, he actually flew to Israel after assurance that the Israeli government and the Israeli Foreign Ministry will provide him the record. He spent time in Israel waiting for the Israeli government to provide him this evidence. And again, Childers concluded that no such evidence or recording was ever given to him. And this is again as early as 1963. So again, Walid al-Khalidi and Erskine B. Childers actually demonstrate or provide for us the fact that no such record of material was present. Now, at a later point, you get other researchers that actually engage in work relative to what's taken place. Now, Ilan Pape, in his book, In the Making of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1947-1951, he actually maintains, again, this is what Walid al-Khalidi said. He says, Plan D, which is Plan Dalit, can be regarded in many respects as a master plan for expulsion. The plan was not conceived out of the blue. Expulsion was considered as one of many means for retaliation against Arab attacks on Jewish convoys and settlements. He said further, nevertheless, it was also regarded as one of the best means of ensuring the domination of the Jews in the areas captured by the Israeli army. In this context, Pape's conclusion directly challenges also Benny Morris's, who actually early on was saying it was not intentional, it was incidental. He says that the expulsion was actually deliberate. Morris himself, Benny Morris, in his writing, he says, was born out of war, not by design, Jewish or Arab. So again, confronted with the fact that there is no recording, Benny Morris was trying to fudge between the lines by saying it was born out of war. And again, it's very important, this concept, born out of war, meaning that because there was a conflict, and sometimes in conflict people leave, and therefore there was no plan, deliberate plan. Because it's very important, because if there is a plan, if there is a deliberation, if there's systematization and a military carrying out, meaning now the state is responsible, and there also would be subject to the full-fledged articulation of the Convention on Genocide, because it's one aspect in terms of the Convention of Genocide is to point to the deliberate nature of the actions that are being carried out. And in here, again, that this is something that we have to be understanding of what took place relative to the 1948. So again, incidental versus systematic. Incidental in terms of in the middle of the war, while there is a systematic plan, preconceived pre-war time that is carried out, and then who is held responsible? The Arab leaders. And again, in here, Morris actually understanding that the evidence is against him, he says it's in an act of war or in the war, and it is not really deliberate, no Arab or Jewish. So in essence, he actually clears, or at least begins to clear this aspect of it. But in a later writing, actually, that is very important and significant, Benny Morris actually begins to accept the notion that the Israeli military was responsible for what took place. But he again uses a very interesting term in here. In essence, he calls it a justifiable ethnic cleansing. A justifiable ethnic cleansing, and which is ironic to point to the notion that there is such a thing as justifiable ethnic cleansing. At what point do we actually think of something being justifiable or unjustifiable? No type of ethnic cleansing, mass killing, expulsion, transfer of any civilian population is ever justifiable. So he writes again in 2001, he says that the 1948 massacres, crimes, expulsion, justifiable ethnic cleansing, meaning that the justification has to be understood that there was a higher goal, and the higher goal was to create a Zionist state of Israel, and all consideration that goal justifies what is being done. And another statement or another reference is basically saying you can't actually make an omelet without cracking eggs or breaking eggs. So in essence, the state of Israel is compared with an omelet, and the eggs that were broken were the Palestinian villages, almost 470 villages, if not more, 8 urban centers, 750,000. So those are the eggs that created the settler colonial Zionist state omelet that we are seeing today. Not that they are stopped at it, but they continue to expansion and taking over the West Bank, creating more omelets called settlements by taking Palestinian lands, cutting trees in order to build a monstrous apartheid wall, another omelet to be created, taking Palestinian water wells, another part of the omelet to be created. So the question becomes, if you're in the business of making omelets and cracking eggs, at what point do you actually begin to think of the consequences that actually those eggs are humans and that omelet is made of destroying the cultural and historical continuity of the Palestinian population? So I think it's very important in here to understand the rationalization that is taking place to dress a project that is rooted in ethnic cleansing and dismantling of the Palestinian society, to dress it up as if it is something that is out of necessity. Nothing in the Zionist settler colonial project was out of necessity. It was by choice, it was by design, it was planned, and the outcome we see to it as such. Now, I would like to actually recommend for individuals who want to really look at and examine the work, to read the work of Walid al-Khalidi. I think his research and his work on Palestine is constantly possibly not as much used and in circulation as it should be. I think he was a pioneer historian that needs to be read and studied and examined. But also I think the work of Ilan Pape is very important, that we need to continue to engage in his work. But there's an important article that I also recommend for people to read, Zionist Massacres, the Creation of the Palestinian Refugee Problem in the 1948 War. This is by Dr. Salah Abdel Jawad. I think his piece is very, very important for anyone that is engaging in the research and engaging in understanding what took place, in order for us to have a broader examination. He went and actually did in his work through a project in Birzeit University, interviews with survivors, and this is again very important in terms of narrating the history, not only oral history, but actually eyewitness reports to what took place. In here, what we often confront is the Palestinian narrative is almost always drowned by systematic nature of Zionist propaganda. So you end up having to actually go through the process of removing and answering the propaganda, that in the process the narrative, the Palestinian narrative of what happened, is to be drowned. And that's again systematic and strategic, and it's been successful, but to a point, and I think what we need is to be aware of it. The strategy is very utilitarian in terms of propaganda. If I say you're a thief, your immediate response will be that I'm not a thief. So again, the discussion became on the term that I gave you. Whether you are a thief or not a thief is no longer about who you are. So again, the Zionists have been very skilled on this. To the Palestinian, well, you're a terrorist. No, I'm not a terrorist. No, you're a terrorist. No, I'm not a terrorist. Now the discussion becomes whether you're a terrorist or not about the settler colonialism and how Israel as a state has been built on the heaps of graves and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So we need to be very clear about this. Often the questions like, well, how come Palestinians are engaged in violence? And I, a person, refuse to be a problem solver for settler colonialism. Those questions are settler colonial questions. They slap you at the face, they take your home, demolish your home, take your land, expel you across the border, and they say, why you're so violent? Right? Again, in here, this is a propaganda tool to reframe the question and make you respond and define the relationship specifically in ways that actually undermines the basic notions of constructing your narrative. So as Palestinians and those who advocate and speak on Palestine need to be very clear of how not to become problem solvers for settler colonialism. If these were questions that come from, let's say, a Gandhian theologians or a Gandhian philosophers, that's a different notion, but it is not. It's often the questions come from individuals that are seeped in rationalization of settler colonialism, if not participating themselves in the settler colonial project, and coming and putting on the question in order to shape the conversation upon the centering the Zionist rationalization and narrative, and therefore problematizing Palestinian history and present. So again, I highly recommend for you to read the Zionist Massacres and the Creation of the Palestinian Refugee Problem in the 1948 War. I point you out to Walid al-Khalid's work. Also, I recommend for you, again, Palestine, It's Something Colonial, my own work, in order for you to have a full context of what the record says. What I would like to conclude this session with the following, that the Palestinian refugee crisis was brought upon because the Zionists wanted to create a state that have a decisive Zionist Jewish majority. And the only way that could come by if Palestinians are expelled and removed systematically in order to arrive at that goal. That project, that idea, that plan is foundational within Zionist epistemic, and it is carried out during the crisis during the war crisis and war period. Now we have a similar type of attempt or a similar type of idea that comes to us also from Netanyahu, who actually recommended for the contemporary period to take opportunity for the conflict that was at Tiananmen Square. Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, who's serving right now, stated in 1989, while serving as Deputy Foreign Minister, he said, quote, just to think about what he's saying, Israel should have taken advantage of the suppression of the demonstrations in China, Tiananmen Square, when the world's attention was focused on what was happening in that country, to carry out mass expulsions among the Arabs of the territory. However, to my regret, they did not support that policy that I proposed and which I still propose should be implemented. Again, so for those who argue that the 1948 was not planned, offer you Bibi Netanyahu, who is in 1989 recommended this policy and still lament the fact that this policy was not adopted. And I would not, again, think that someone whose idea is of this framework is committed to anything other than the expulsion of the Palestinians, if not by direct means, then by silent ethnic cleansing, which is taking place today by making it difficult on the Palestinians, whether by the apartheid wall, the continued expansion of settlement, disrupting the Palestinian economy, the repressive military structure that is also supported and nurtured by the Palestinian Authority, the United States contribution and Arab world involvement. All these leads to the process of ethnic cleansing. So we need to understand what we are facing at this particular time in order for us to correct as well as to challenge it. I do believe that challenging it and the change is coming. It might take some time, but it is coming. Why? Because its foundation is founded upon something that is completely and inherently anti-moral and it's not ethical, and it's also founded upon an ethnic cleansing. And again, this is what should energize us to constantly engage in the PDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanction, to make sure that this aspect of history is centered, Palestinian narrative is centered, and we're not problem solvers for Zionism, settler colonialism. And I think this is the basic outlook of this type of project of Palestine through a decolonial lens, is not for us to fall in the traps that begins to assign to us the role of solving the problem for a settler colonialism and essentially utilize our skill, knowledge, and research for that project. So thank you for listening, and look forward to seeing you again next week as we continue in this discussion. Welcome your questions, your feedback on the website, but please, if you're a Zionist troll, the delete button will always be there for much of your engagement. I am not a problem solver for Zionist settler colonialism. If that's what you're seeking, maybe you should look at the Palestinian Authority or others for that role. Assalamu alaikum, and see you again next week.